In the dense forests of Eastern Europe, where the morning mist clings to ancient pine trees like ghostly fingers, a single rifle shot can change the course of history. This is not a tale of Hollywood heroes or fictional warriors. This is the true story of Katerina Volkov, a 23-year-old farm girl who became one of the most feared snipers of World War II. Armed with nothing but a hunting rifle, her grandfather left her, and an unshakable determination to protect her homeland. She would face impossible odds that would test every fiber of her being. What happened in those frozen trenches during the winter of 1943 defied all military logic. How does one person, outnumbered 12 to 1, not only survive but completely vanish, while leaving behind a trail that would puzzle enemy commanders for decades? The answer lies in a combination of raw skill, desperate courage, and a deep understanding of the land that raised her. This is her story. Every bullet fired, every breath held in the crosshairs, every heartbeat that echoed in the silence before the kill. This is how a simple farm girl became a ghost that haunted the nightmares of an entire enemy division, and how she disappeared into legend when her mission seemed impossible to complete. Some say she's still out there, watching, waiting. Others claim she died that cold February morning when the snow turned red. But the truth, as you'll discover, is far more extraordinary than either version suggests. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Volkov family farm as Katerina adjusted the scope on her grandfather's old hunting rifle. She had been practicing since dawn, picking off tin cans arranged along the wooden fence that bordered their property. Each shot rang out crisp and clean in the cold air, echoing across the rolling hills of rural Belarus. Her younger brother Dmitry watched from the porch, counting her hits with the enthusiasm only a 10-year-old could muster. 17 out of 17, he shouted, his voice carrying the pride that their father had once shown when watching Katerina shoot. Their father was gone now, taken by the war like so many other men from their village. Their mother worked the fields with hands that grew more calloused each day, trying to maintain the farm that had fed their family for 3 generations. Katerina lowered the rifle and wiped the sweat from her forehead, despite the February chill. She had inherited more than just her grandfather's weapon. Old Ivan Volkov had been a hunter of legendary skill, known throughout the region for his ability to track and take down the largest bears and wolves that roamed the forests. He had taught her to read the wind, to understand the subtle shifts in light that could make the difference between a clean kill and a wounded animal that might turn dangerous. The rifle doesn't make the hunter, he had told her during those long afternoons when she was just 12 years old. The hunter makes the rifle. You must become one with the weapon, feel every part of it as if it were part of your own body. Only then can you truly hit what you aim for. Those lessons seemed more important now than they ever had before. The war had reached their quiet corner of the world 3 months ago when German forces had swept through the region, establishing a series of outposts and patrol routes that effectively cut off their village from the outside world. The soldiers who came through demanded food, supplies, and information about partisan activity in the area. They were polite enough at first, but Katerina could see the calculation in their eyes as they assessed what could be taken and what could be controlled. The real trouble had started 2 weeks ago, when her neighbor, old Mikhail Petrov, had refused to hand over his last remaining pig to a German patrol. The soldiers had shot him in his own doorway while his wife watched from behind the kitchen window. Since then, the atmosphere in the village had changed completely. People spoke in whispers, children were kept indoors, and everyone understood that their peaceful existence was over. Katerina had made her decision that very night. As she watched Mikhail's widow weeping over his body, she would not wait for someone else to protect her family and her community. She would take action herself. The plan had formed slowly over the following days as she observed the German patrol patterns and studied the terrain around their farm. The enemy had established 12 different positions in a rough circle around the village, each manned by a small unit of soldiers. They rotated their patrols on a schedule that seemed random but actually followed a pattern she had begun to recognize. More importantly, they had grown comfortable in their positions, confident that the local population posed no real threat to their operations. Katerina knew better than to attack them directly. 12 units meant probably 60 to 70 soldiers, all better armed and trained than she was. But she also understood something they didn't about the land they now occupied. Every hill, every tree, every stream and rocky outcropping held secrets that only someone who had grown up here could truly appreciate. She knew hidden paths through the forest that had been carved by generations of hunters and farmers. She understood how sound traveled differently in different weather conditions and which positions offered the best concealment at various times of day. Her mother had noticed her increased interest in the family's hunting supplies. Elena Volkov was a practical woman who had learned to read danger in the set of her daughter's shoulders and the intensity of her focus. She had said nothing when Katerina began taking longer walks around their property, or when she started asking detailed questions about the locations of old hunting blinds and abandoned farm structures in the surrounding area. "You're planning something," Elena had finally said the night before, cornering Katerina in the kitchen after Dmitri had gone to bed. "I can see it in your eyes. You have the same look your grandfather had when he was tracking something particularly dangerous." Katerina had looked up from the map she had been sketching, showing the approximate locations of the German positions based on her observations. She could have lied to her mother, made up some story about wanting to hunt for meat to supplement their dwindling food supplies. Instead, she had shown Elena the map and explained exactly what she intended to do. Elena had studied the drawing in silence for several long minutes. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but filled with a mixture of pride and terror. "You understand what you're proposing? If they catch you, they'll kill you. Worse than that, they might kill all of us in retaliation." "If we do nothing, they'll kill us anyway," Katerina had replied. "Maybe not today or tomorrow, but eventually. I've seen how these things progress. They take a little more each time, until there's nothing left to take. Then they decide we're not useful anymore." Her mother had nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in those words. She had lived through enough hardship to understand that sometimes the most dangerous action was no action at all. "What do you need from me?" Now, as Katerina prepared for what might be her final morning on the farm, she reviewed the plan one more time. She would begin with the easternmost position, a small outpost built around an abandoned barn about 2 miles from their house. According to her observations, this position was usually manned by 4 soldiers who rotated guard duty in pairs. The terrain offered several approach routes through a network of drainage ditches and stone walls that would allow her to get within effective range without being detected. The key was not just eliminating the guards, but doing so in a way that would create confusion and draw the other units away from their positions. She needed them to respond predictably, moving along routes she could anticipate and control. This meant her attacks had to appear random while actually following a carefully planned sequence designed to herd the enemy forces into positions where they would be vulnerable to further strikes. Katerina checked her equipment one final time. Besides the rifle, she carried a hunting knife that had belonged to her grandfather, a compass, a small supply of food and water, and ammunition she had carefully rationed from the family's hunting supplies. She wore clothing that would help her blend with the winter landscape, dark browns and greys that would be nearly invisible against the bare trees and rocky ground. Most importantly, she carried the knowledge passed down through generations of hunters and farmers who had learned to survive in this harsh but beautiful land. She knew where to find shelter when the weather turned bad, how to move silently through different types of terrain, and how to read the subtle signs that would tell her when danger was approaching. As she kissed her mother and brother goodbye, Katerina felt the weight of what she was attempting settle fully onto her shoulders. She was not a soldier or a trained sniper. She was a farm girl with a hunting rifle who was about to take on a force that had conquered most of Europe. The odds against success were overwhelming, but she had learned from her grandfather that the most important factor in any hunt was not the size or strength of the prey, but the patience and skill of the hunter. The eastern position lay ahead of her through 2 miles of forest and farmland that she knew better than anyone else in the world. Somewhere in those fields and trees, 12 enemy units waited in positions they believed were secure. They were about to discover how wrong they were. Katerina shouldered her rifle and began walking toward the tree line, leaving behind the safety of everything she had ever known. Behind her, smoke rose from the chimney of the farmhouse where her family waited and prayed. Ahead lay a test that would either make her a legend or claim her life in the attempt. The hunt was about to begin. The first light of dawn was still hours away when Katerina reached the edge of the forest that bordered the eastern outpost. She had traveled the 2 miles from her family's farm using paths that existed more in memory than reality, following routes her grandfather had shown her during countless hunting expeditions. The journey had taken nearly 3 hours as she moved carefully through the darkness, stopping frequently to listen for any sounds that might indicate enemy patrols. Now she lay concealed beneath a fallen pine tree, studying the abandoned barn that the German forces had converted into their observation post. Through her rifle scope, she could make out the silhouettes of 2 guards positioned near the building's entrance. Their cigarettes glowed like tiny orange stars in the pre-dawn darkness, marking their exact positions as clearly as if they had been wearing targets on their chests. Katerina had chosen this particular outpost for her first strike because of its isolated position and the tactical advantages the surrounding terrain offered. The barn sat on a slight rise overlooking a crossroads that connected several farm communities in the area. The Germans had selected it precisely because it provided excellent visibility across the surrounding countryside. What they hadn't considered was that the same elevation that gave them a commanding view also made them visible from multiple concealed positions in the surrounding forest. She settled into her shooting position with the patience her grandfather had drilled into her during years of hunting the craftiest prey in these woods. The rifle felt familiar and comforting in her hands, an extension of her will rather than simply a tool. She had fired thousands of rounds through this weapon, knew exactly how it behaved in different weather conditions, and could compensate instinctively for factors like wind speed and the slight pull to the left that had developed over years of use. The range to the nearest guard was approximately 200 meters, well within her effective shooting distance. At this range, with good visibility and minimal wind, she could place her shots with surgical precision. The challenge would not be making the shots themselves, but managing the sequence of events that would follow once she opened fire. Katerina had spent considerable time thinking through the tactical implications of her planned assault. The moment she fired the first shot, every German position in the area would be alerted to her presence. They would immediately begin trying to locate her position and coordinate a response that would bring overwhelming firepower to bear on her location. Her survival would depend entirely on her ability to complete her mission and escape before their response could trap her. The eastern outpost typically housed 4 soldiers who worked in shifts of 2. This meant that while 2 guards maintained watch outside the building, 2 more were resting inside the barn itself. Her plan called for eliminating the outside guards first, then dealing with the soldiers inside before they could radio an effective warning to the other positions. She lined up her first shot, placing the crosshairs carefully on the center of the nearest guard's chest. The man was leaning against a wooden post, completely relaxed, and obviously convinced that no real danger existed in this quiet rural area. His casual attitude would cost him his life in the next few seconds. Katerina controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate and steadying her hands in the familiar ritual that preceded every important shot. She had learned this technique while hunting deer with her grandfather, who had taught her that the moment of firing was sacred, requiring complete focus and respect for the life that was about to be taken. The rifle cracked sharply in the cold morning air, the sound echoing briefly off the surrounding hills before fading into silence. The first guard dropped immediately, killed instantly by a shot that took him precisely through the heart. His companion spun around in confusion, trying to locate the source of the gunshot while simultaneously attempting to reach the radio equipment inside the barn. Katerina was already working the bolt of her rifle, chambering a fresh round while tracking the second guard's movement through her scope. The man was moving erratically, making himself a more difficult target, but his panic also made his actions predictable. He was heading for the barn's entrance in a straight line, focused entirely on reaching the radio rather than taking evasive action. Her second shot took him down just as his hand touched the barn door. He collapsed forward, his body partially blocking the entrance and creating an obstacle that would slow the response of the soldiers inside. Katerina immediately shifted position, moving 20 meters to her left while keeping the barn under observation through her scope. The 2 remaining guards emerged from the building within seconds, their weapons ready but their movements revealing their confusion about where the attack was coming from. They had heard 2 shots fired in rapid succession, but the echoing effects of the surrounding hills made it impossible for them to pinpoint the shooter's location with any accuracy. Katerina waited patiently as the soldiers attempted to establish a defensive position using the barn's stone foundation for cover. Their training told them to find concealment and call for reinforcements, but they were operating with incomplete information about the threat they faced. They assumed they were dealing with multiple attackers positioned somewhere in the forest, not a single sniper who had already moved to a new firing position. Her third shot eliminated the soldier who was attempting to operate the radio, ensuring that no detailed warning could be transmitted to the other German positions. The fourth guard immediately dove for cover behind a pile of firewood, but his chosen position left his legs exposed beneath the stacked logs. Katerina's final shot struck him in the thigh, severing the femoral artery and ensuring that he would bleed out within minutes even if he received immediate medical attention. She could have killed him outright, but leaving him wounded served her tactical purposes better than another clean kill. A wounded soldier would create additional complications for any rescue attempt, and his calls for help would provide valuable intelligence about enemy response procedures. The entire engagement had lasted less than 3 minutes from the first shot to the last. 4 enemy soldiers had been eliminated with 4 precisely placed rifle rounds, and the eastern outpost had been effectively neutralized. More importantly, the sounds of gunfire had certainly been heard by the other German positions in the area, which meant her plan to draw them out of their defensive positions was already beginning to work. Katerina immediately began moving toward her next planned position, following a route that would take her through a series of drainage ditches and stone walls toward the southeastern outpost. She could already hear the sounds of vehicles starting up in the distance, indicating that the enemy was beginning to respond to the attack. Their reaction time was better than she had hoped, but still well within the parameters she had planned for. As she moved through the pre-dawn darkness, Katerina allowed herself a moment of satisfaction at the success of her opening strike. 4 enemy soldiers had been eliminated, without any return fire or significant risk to her own safety. The tactical situation was developing exactly as she had anticipated, with the German forces beginning to move in predictable patterns that she could exploit, but she also understood that the easy part was now over. The surprise advantage that had allowed her to strike so effectively would be gone once the enemy began coordinating their response. From this point forward, she would be facing soldiers who knew they were under attack and were actively hunting for her position. The real test of her skills was about to begin as she prepared to engage the next target, while avoiding the search parties that were certainly being organized to track her down. Everything she had learned during years of hunting in these forests would be put to the ultimate test as she attempted to stay one step ahead of an increasingly desperate and dangerous enemy force. Behind her, the eastern outpost stood silent except for the groans of the wounded soldiers she had left alive. Ahead lay 11 more positions that she would need to eliminate or neutralize if her mission was to succeed. The hunt was far from over, but she had drawn first blood and established the terms of engagement on ground that favored her knowledge and abilities. Katerina moved deeper into the forest, already planning her next strike while listening to the sounds of the enemy response building in the distance. The game of cat and mouse that would determine whether she lived or died had officially begun. The southeastern outpost presented a completely different tactical challenge than the isolated barn where Katerina had achieved her first success. This position had been established in a cluster of farm buildings that included a stone house, several wooden outbuildings, and a network of low walls that provided multiple defensive positions for the 6 soldiers stationed there. Katerina observed the enemy position from a concealed location among a stand of birch trees approximately 400 meters away. The increased range would test her marksmanship skills to their limits, but it also provided her with several escape routes through the dense forest that surrounded this area. She had chosen this position carefully, knowing that the longer-range shots would be more difficult, but that the tactical advantages of the terrain were worth the extra challenge. Through her scope, she could see that the German soldiers had already been alerted by the sounds of gunfire from the eastern outpost. They had established a defensive perimeter around their position and were maintaining heightened alertness while presumably waiting for orders from their command structure. Their improved readiness would make them more difficult targets, but their predictable defensive positions also made them easier to locate and engage. The radio chatter she could hear in the distance indicated that the enemy was beginning to coordinate their response to her initial attack. Vehicle engines were starting up at multiple locations, and she could detect the movement of personnel as the various outposts began implementing whatever emergency procedures they had established for this type of situation. This meant she had a limited window of opportunity before their response became more organized and effective. Katerina selected her first target carefully, choosing a soldier who was positioned near the stone house with excellent visibility across the surrounding countryside. His elimination would force the remaining guards to adjust their positions, creating opportunities for follow-up shots while also denying the enemy one of their primary observation posts. The range made this shot significantly more challenging than her earlier work. At 400 meters, factors like wind speed, bullet drop, and even the slight tremor in her hands became critical variables that could determine success or failure. She spent several minutes studying the movement of grass and leaves to gauge wind conditions, then made the necessary adjustments to her point of aim. Her shot struck the target precisely where she had intended, dropping him instantly and causing immediate chaos among the remaining soldiers. They had heard the gunshot but couldn't determine its direction because of the distance involved and the acoustic effects of the surrounding buildings. Their confusion bought her precious seconds to line up her next shot before they could establish effective cover. The second target was a soldier who had been positioned near one of the wooden outbuildings. He was attempting to reach a radio when Katerina's bullet found him, eliminating another potential source of detailed intelligence about her position and capabilities. The remaining 4 guards were now fully aware that they were under sniper fire, but they still didn't know exactly where the shots were coming from. Katerina immediately shifted position, moving 50 meters to her right while maintaining visual contact with the enemy outpost. This movement was crucial because trained soldiers would eventually be able to determine the general direction of sniper fire based on the sound signatures of multiple shots. By changing position between engagements, she could maintain the uncertainty that was her primary tactical advantage. Her third shot was the most difficult yet, taken at a soldier who had found excellent cover behind a stone wall, but had made the mistake of exposing his shoulder while trying to observe the surrounding forest. The target area was small and partially obscured, requiring absolute precision to achieve an effective hit. The bullet struck exactly where she had aimed, but the soldier's position behind the wall prevented her from confirming whether the wound was fatal or merely incapacitating. The remaining 3 soldiers had now identified the general direction from which the shots were being fired, and they were beginning to return fire with their automatic weapons. Bullets began striking the trees around Katerina's position, forcing her to take cover and temporarily halting her ability to engage additional targets. The enemy fire was not particularly accurate at this range, but it demonstrated that their training was beginning to overcome their initial shock and confusion. Katerina waited patiently for the enemy fire to slacken before moving to yet another firing position. She had anticipated this development and had already identified multiple locations from which she could continue her attack. The key was maintaining pressure on the enemy while avoiding the concentrated return fire that would inevitably follow each time she revealed her position by shooting. Her 4th shot eliminated another soldier who had attempted to flank her position by moving through a drainage ditch that ran along the edge of the farm property. The man had shown good tactical sense by using the available cover, but Katerina had observed his movement and was waiting when he exposed himself at a crossing point where the ditch passed under a farm road. By this point, the sounds of approaching vehicles were becoming clearly audible from multiple directions. The enemy response was becoming coordinated, with reinforcements moving toward her general area from several different outposts. Katerina realized that she had perhaps 2 or 3 minutes before the tactical situation would become untenable, and she would need to break contact and move to a different area entirely. She used those precious minutes to engage the final 2 soldiers at the southeastern outpost, taking carefully aimed shots that eliminated both targets and completed the neutralization of this enemy position. Her ammunition supply was beginning to run low, but she had achieved her primary objective of drawing the enemy forces out of their static defensive positions and forcing them to respond to her attacks. The sound of diesel engines was now very close, indicating that enemy reinforcements would arrive within the next few minutes. Katerina began implementing her extraction plan, moving quickly through the forest along routes she had memorized during her earlier reconnaissance of the area. Her knowledge of the local terrain was now absolutely critical, as she needed to evade pursuit while moving toward her next planned engagement area. As she moved through the trees, Katerina could hear the enemy forces arriving at the southeastern outpost behind her. Voices shouted in German as the soldiers discovered the bodies of their comrades and attempted to determine what had happened. She caught fragments of radio communications as they reported the situation to their command structure and requested additional support. The enemy response was becoming more sophisticated and better coordinated than she had initially expected. This was both good and bad news for her mission. The improved coordination meant that her subsequent attacks would be more dangerous and difficult to execute. However, it also meant that more enemy forces were being drawn away from their original positions, creating opportunities for her to strike at targets that were now less well defended. Katerina reached a predetermined rally point where she had cached additional ammunition and supplies during her preparation for this mission. The small supply depot was concealed in a natural cave formation that had been used by local hunters for generations. She took a few minutes to resupply her ammunition, eat some food, and plan her next move based on what she had observed about enemy response patterns. The sounds of the search operation were spreading across a wider area as more units joined the hunt for her position. She could hear vehicles moving along the farm roads and the distinctive sound of soldiers moving through the forest in organized search patterns. Their response was professional and systematic, indicating that she was dealing with experienced troops rather than the poorly trained garrison forces she had initially hoped to encounter. However, their search patterns also revealed important information about their capabilities and limitations. The soldiers were moving in ways that indicated they expected to be dealing with a small group of partisan fighters rather than a single sniper. Their search techniques were designed for finding hidden camps or supply caches, not for tracking an individual who was actively moving through familiar terrain. This misunderstanding of the threat they faced was an advantage Katerina could exploit. As long as the enemy continued to search for a group of fighters hidden in a fixed position, they would be vulnerable to attacks from an individual who could move freely through the landscape and strike from unexpected directions. Katerina completed her resupply and began moving toward the southwestern outpost, where intelligence gathered during her earlier reconnaissance indicated that a radio communications hub had been established. Eliminating this target would significantly disrupt enemy coordination and create additional confusion that she could exploit during the remainder of her mission. Behind her, the sounds of the search operation continued to grow in intensity as more enemy forces were drawn into the hunt. Ahead lay another carefully planned engagement that would test her abilities against increasingly alert and determined opposition. The hunt was entering a new phase, one that would require all of her skills and cunning if she was to survive long enough to complete her mission. The communications hub at the southwestern outpost represented the most dangerous target Katerina had yet attempted to engage. Unlike the previous positions, this facility was heavily defended with 8 soldiers and included sophisticated radio equipment that maintained contact with the broader German command structure in the region. More critically, it was positioned in terrain that offered limited concealment and fewer escape routes than the forest environments where she had achieved her earlier successes. Katerina approached the target area with extreme caution, using a network of irrigation ditches and farm roads that allowed her to get within 300 meters of the enemy position without being detected. The outpost had been established around a large farmhouse with several outbuildings, all connected by communication lines, and defended by carefully positioned machine gun nests that covered the primary approaches to the facility. Through her scope, she could observe the increased level of activity at this position compared to her earlier targets. The soldiers were moving with purpose and urgency, obviously responding to orders received through their radio communications with other units in the area. She could see personnel entering and leaving the main building frequently, suggesting that this location served as a coordination center for the broader enemy response to her attacks. The tactical situation had become significantly more complex since her earlier engagements. The enemy now knew they were dealing with a skilled sniper who was systematically attacking their positions, and they were implementing countermeasures designed to limit her effectiveness. Guard rotations had been increased, observation posts had been reinforced, and she could see evidence of attempts to coordinate fields of fire between different positions. More troubling was the evidence of enemy forces beginning to establish a perimeter around the general area where she was operating. Vehicle sounds indicated that mobile units were positioning themselves along the major roads and pathways that provided access to this region. If these forces succeeded in establishing an effective cordon, her ability to move freely between targets would be severely compromised. Katerina realized that her attack on the communications hub would need to be executed quickly and decisively. The longer she remained in the area, the more time the enemy would have to tighten their search net around her position. However, the importance of this target justified the increased risk, as eliminating the communications facility would severely disrupt enemy coordination during the critical period when they were attempting to organize an effective response to her campaign. She selected a firing position in an abandoned grain silo that provided excellent visibility across the target area, while also offering multiple escape routes through a maze of agricultural buildings and equipment. The range to the nearest targets was approximately 250 meters, which represented a good compromise between accuracy and tactical flexibility. Her first priority was eliminating the soldiers who were operating the radio equipment inside the main building. These personnel represented the greatest immediate threat to her mission, as they could coordinate reinforcements and direct search operations with devastating effectiveness. However, they were also the most difficult targets to engage, as they were positioned inside the building with only occasional exposure when they moved between different communication stations. Katerina waited patiently for nearly an hour, studying the movement patterns of personnel around the communications hub and identifying the optimal sequence for engaging multiple targets. Her observation revealed that the enemy soldiers had established a routine that involved regular checks of the radio equipment, perimeter security inspections, and coordination with the search teams that were operating in the surrounding area. The opportunity she had been waiting for finally presented itself when 2 soldiers emerged from the main building to conduct a perimeter inspection, while a third remained visible through a window operating the primary radio console. This gave her the chance to engage multiple high-value targets in rapid succession before the enemy could mount an effective response. Her first shot struck the radio operator through the window, eliminating him with a precisely placed round that also damaged some of the communication equipment visible in the background. The 2 soldiers conducting the perimeter inspection immediately sought cover, but their training caused them to move toward predetermined defensive positions that Katerina had already identified during her observation period. Her second and third shots eliminated both soldiers before they could reach their intended positions or alert the remaining personnel inside the building. The rapid succession of shots created immediate chaos among the surviving defenders, who were now fully aware that they were under sniper attack but still uncertain about the location from which the shots were being fired. Katerina immediately shifted position within the grain silo, moving to a different firing port that offered a better angle on the remaining enemy positions. This movement was critical because the soldiers would be attempting to determine her location based on the sound signatures of her previous shots, and any delay in changing position could result in concentrated return fire that would force her to abandon the engagement. The remaining 5 soldiers had taken cover in and around the various buildings that comprised the communications facility, but their positions were still observable from Katerina's elevated vantage point in the grain silo. She began engaging them systematically, taking carefully aimed shots at targets of opportunity while maintaining awareness of her ammunition supply and the need to preserve rounds for the escape phase of her mission. Her 4th shot wounded a soldier who was attempting to reach an alternate radio position in one of the outbuildings. The man went down but remained conscious and mobile, which meant he could still pose a threat if not properly neutralized. However, attempts to confirm the kill would expose her to return fire from the remaining defenders, forcing her to accept the tactical compromise of leaving a potentially active enemy behind her position. The enemy return fire began almost immediately, with automatic weapons fire directed toward the grain silo from multiple positions around the communications facility. The incoming rounds struck the building's walls and infrastructure, creating a shower of concrete dust and debris that limited her visibility and made precise shooting much more difficult. However, the structural integrity of the silo provided excellent protection against small arms fire, allowing her to continue the engagement despite the increasingly intense enemy response. Katerina's 5th and 6th shots eliminated 2 more soldiers who had attempted to establish firing positions that would allow them to suppress her location. These engagements required extremely precise shooting under difficult conditions, as the targets were partially concealed and the incoming fire was creating significant distraction and stress. However, her years of hunting experience had taught her to maintain focus and control even when operating under pressure. By this point, the sounds of approaching vehicles indicated that enemy reinforcements were converging on the communications hub from multiple directions. Katerina could hear the distinctive sound of military trucks and possibly armored vehicles moving along the farm roads that provided access to this area. Her window of opportunity for continuing the engagement was rapidly closing, and she needed to complete her mission and begin her extraction within the next few minutes. Her 7th shot eliminated another defender, leaving only 2 enemy soldiers still active at the communications facility. However, these final targets had found excellent cover and were maintaining disciplined fire that made it extremely dangerous for her to expose herself for the precise shooting required to finish the engagement. The tactical situation was approaching the point where continued offensive action would become prohibitively risky. Katerina made the decision to terminate the engagement and begin her extraction before the arriving reinforcements could trap her in the grain silo. She had succeeded in eliminating 6 of the 8 soldiers defending the communications hub and had completely disrupted their ability to coordinate with the broader enemy command structure. While not a complete tactical victory, the attack had achieved its primary objectives and significantly degraded enemy capabilities during a critical period. She began moving toward her predetermined escape route, using maintenance ladders and catwalks inside the grain silo to reach ground level without exposing herself to observation from the remaining enemy defenders. The sound of approaching vehicles was now very close, indicating that she had perhaps 2 or 3 minutes before enemy forces would arrive in sufficient strength to establish an effective cordon around the area. The escape route led through a series of drainage ditches and farm roads that would take her away from the communications hub and toward a rally point where she had cached additional supplies for the next phase of her mission. However, the increasing tempo of enemy activity in the area meant that this movement would be far more dangerous than her earlier displacements between target areas. As Katerina began moving through the agricultural landscape toward her next objective, she could hear the sounds of the enemy response intensifying behind her. Vehicle engines, radio chatter, and the movement of personnel indicated that the German forces were implementing a comprehensive search operation designed to locate and eliminate the threat she represented. The hunt was entering its most dangerous phase, with her survival depending entirely on her ability to stay ahead of increasingly determined and well-coordinated opposition. The final phase of Katerina's mission began as the winter sun reached its highest point in the grey February sky. She had spent the past hour moving carefully through a landscape that was now swarming with enemy search teams, their vehicles creating a network of roadblocks and patrol routes designed to prevent her escape. The sounds of their operations filled the air, voices calling out in German, engines starting and stopping, and the occasional burst of automatic weapons fire as nervous soldiers shot at shadows in the forest. Katerina had managed to evade the search team so far by using her intimate knowledge of the local terrain to move through areas that the enemy couldn't effectively monitor. Hidden paths through marshland, abandoned farm buildings that provided temporary concealment, and natural features like ravines and dense thickets had allowed her to stay ahead of the pursuit while moving toward her final objective. That objective was the most heavily defended position in the entire German network, a command post that had been established in the ruins of an old monastery on a hilltop overlooking the entire region. Intelligence she had gathered during her reconnaissance indicated that this facility housed the senior officers responsible for coordinating all enemy operations in the area, along with the communication equipment and maps that directed the activities of all 12 outposts. More importantly for her current situation, the command post was also serving as the headquarters for the search operation that was attempting to locate and eliminate her. Every radio communication directing the movements of the pursuit teams originated from this location, and the destruction of this facility would create the chaos and confusion necessary for her to escape the tightening net of enemy forces. The approach to the monastery required crossing nearly 2 kilometers of relatively open farmland, with minimal cover and concealment. Under normal circumstances, this movement would have been extremely dangerous for a single individual attempting to avoid detection. However, the current tactical situation actually worked in her favor, as the enemy search teams were focused on areas where they believed she was hiding rather than routes that led toward their most secure facility. Katerina used the network of stone walls and hedgerows that divided the farm fields to mask her movement toward the monastery. The approach took nearly 3 hours of careful movement, with frequent stops to observe enemy patrol patterns and avoid detection by the search teams that were operating throughout the area. Her knowledge of local agricultural practices proved invaluable, as she understood which routes farmers used during different seasons and which areas would provide the best concealment during winter months. The monastery itself presented a formidable defensive challenge. The ancient stone building had been reinforced with modern military positions, including machine gun nests that covered the primary approach routes and communication equipment that maintained constant contact with all German forces in the region. The facility was defended by at least 12 soldiers, including several officers whose capture or elimination would significantly impact enemy operations throughout the area. However, the very features that made the monastery an excellent command post also created vulnerabilities that a skilled sniper could exploit. The elevated position that provided commanding views of the surrounding countryside also made the defenders visible from multiple concealed positions in the surrounding forest. The ancient architecture included numerous windows and firing ports that offered excellent fields of fire for the defenders, but also created multiple potential target areas for an attacker with the skill to exploit them. Katerina established her final firing position in a cluster of pine trees approximately 600 meters from the monastery. This was the longest range she had attempted during her entire mission, pushing her marksmanship skills to their absolute limits. However, the distance also provided her with crucial advantages in terms of concealment and tactical flexibility, as the enemy would have extreme difficulty locating her position even after she began firing. The range required her to make careful calculations for bullet drop, wind drift, and other factors that became increasingly significant at extended distances. She spent considerable time studying atmospheric conditions and making the mental adjustments necessary for accurate long-range shooting. Every shot at this distance would require absolute precision, as the margin for error was essentially zero. Her first target was an officer who appeared to be directing operations from a position near the monastery's main entrance. Through her scope, she could observe him consulting maps and communicating with subordinates in a manner that suggested he held significant authority within the enemy command structure. His elimination would create immediate disruption in the coordination of the search operation, while also removing a key leader from the enemy organization. The shot required nearly perfect execution due to the extreme range and the partial concealment provided by the monastery's architecture. Katerina spent several minutes preparing for the engagement, controlling her breathing, and eliminating any trace of movement that might affect her accuracy. When she finally fired, the bullet traveled for nearly 2 seconds before striking the target precisely where she had aimed. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The officer collapsed instantly, creating panic among the other personnel at the command post who had no idea where the shot had originated. Their confusion was amplified by the acoustic effects of the monastery's stone walls, which made it impossible for them to determine the direction from which the sniper fire was coming. Katerina immediately began working to eliminate the communication personnel who were attempting to coordinate a response to the attack. These soldiers represented the greatest immediate threat to her mission, as they could direct the search teams to converge on her general area once they determined the approximate direction of the sniper fire. However, their positions inside the building made them extremely difficult targets, visible only when they moved past windows or doorways. Her second shot eliminated a soldier who was attempting to operate radio equipment from a position near one of the monastery's upper windows. The round struck him precisely as he was transmitting what appeared to be an urgent message, cutting off the communication in mid-sentence and adding to the confusion among both the defenders at the command post and the search teams operating in the surrounding area. The enemy response to the sniper attack was swift but poorly coordinated. Soldiers began firing in multiple directions, apparently uncertain about the location of the threat they faced. Their return fire was concentrated in areas much closer to the monastery than Katerina's actual position, indicating that they had seriously underestimated the range from which she was engaging them. This confusion provided her with the opportunity to continue her attack against the communication facilities that were her primary objectives. Her third and fourth shots targeted additional radio operators, eliminating them before they could establish effective communication with the search teams that were operating throughout the region. Each successful engagement further degraded the enemy's ability to coordinate their response and increased the chaos that would mask her eventual escape. However, Katerina was also aware that her ammunition supply was nearly exhausted and that the enemy would eventually determine her approximate position based on the direction of her shots. She needed to complete her mission quickly and begin her extraction before the defenders could organize an effective counterattack or direct the search teams to her location. Her final shots were directed at the remaining personnel visible around the command post, with particular emphasis on anyone who appeared to be attempting to restore communication capabilities or coordinate defensive measures. Each engagement required careful consideration of target priority and ammunition conservation, as she needed to preserve enough rounds to provide covering fire during her escape if necessary. The last shot Katerina fired struck a soldier who was attempting to establish an alternate communication position using portable radio equipment. His elimination completed the systematic destruction of the enemy's command and control capabilities, ensuring that the search teams operating in the area would be unable to receive coordinated direction for at least several hours. As she prepared to begin her extraction, Katerina could observe the complete disruption of enemy operations at the monastery. Personnel were moving without apparent purpose or coordination. Defensive positions had been abandoned as soldiers sought cover from continued sniper fire, and no effective communication appeared to be taking place between the command post and the forces operating in the surrounding area. The sounds of the search operation in the distance were also changing character, with less coordinated movement and more random, undirected activity as individual units lost contact with their command structure. The systematic elimination of the communication facilities had achieved exactly the effect Katerina had hoped for, creating the chaos necessary for her to escape the area while the enemy struggled to reorganize their operations. Katerina began moving away from her firing position, using an escape route that would take her through the deepest forest areas where vehicle pursuit would be impossible and foot patrols would have extreme difficulty maintaining contact. Her knowledge of the local terrain remained her greatest advantage, allowing her to navigate through areas that would be virtually impassable for the enemy forces attempting to locate her. As she disappeared into the forest, leaving behind a scene of complete tactical destruction, Katerina had succeeded in eliminating or neutralizing all 12 enemy positions while avoiding capture or serious injury. The mission that had begun with a simple desire to protect her family and community had evolved into a systematic campaign that had completely disrupted German operations throughout the region. Behind her, the sounds of confused enemy activity continued as soldiers attempted to understand what had happened and restore some semblance of operational capability. Ahead lay the long journey back to her family's farm, where her mother and brother waited anxiously for news of her survival. The farm girl who had left home that morning with her grandfather's hunting rifle had become something far more dangerous and legendary than anyone could have imagined. She had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious through a combination of skill, courage, and intimate knowledge of the land that had shaped her entire life. But most importantly, she had vanished into the forest like a ghost, leaving behind only the evidence of her deadly work and the growing legend of the sharpshooter who had outsmarted an entire enemy division. The hunt was over, but the mystery of her disappearance was just beginning.